welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. So today is a pleasure to introduce Petros Koumoutsakos. So he's a professor at Harvard University. I think that you moved in 2020 before you were in ETH. So he's the faculty director of the Institute for Applied Computational Science and also the department chair of Applied Mathematics. So before that, he got his PhD in Caltech. I think that with Tony Leonard. Yeah, exactly. So he has also been the recipient of several awards, including a Gordon Bell, so very prestigious award. And today he's going to talk about artificial intelligence and scientific computing and some applications to fluid mechanics, probably. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Adrian. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy to see a lot of friends in the audience. So I will tell you about my adventures in AI and scientific computing, and I, in particular, will focus on some ideas on prediction and control in fluid mechanics. And I hope to tell you about things that I have found to be interesting and things that have been working for us and things that have not been not working for us. And I will be welcoming any questions and suggestions and comments that you may have. Just to tell you some of the people that have been behind this work, their names are listed here. And Wim is among us in the audience. They have participated along with many more others in many of the things that you see in the things that I will be presenting today. So I'm very thankful. Computers, much like other fields, they have transformed fluid mechanics. So when I first started computing, that was back in 1981. So that was the first computer that I had my hands on. And when you look at what has happened over the last 30 or 40 years, then you realize that you have a tremendous increase in in the computational power that we have. So when we study fluid mechanics, I'll show you some of the biggest simulations we have done. We have been looking into flow inside carbon nanotubes, and we have been looking actually in micrometer long carbon nanotubes, and we have been interested to figure out what is the flow rate inside the carbon nanotube. So we have been conducting large-scale molecular dynamic simulations. We have also done some very large-scale simulations of red blood cells at submicron resolutions inside millimeter-long microfluidic devices. We were interested to find out if we could separate circulating tumor cells from the red blood cells. If you don't mind turning down the lights, maybe easier for the eye to see the movies, if that's okay with you. Yes, okay, well, at least, well, now you don't see me, which is even better. So that's it. So, and then some other things that we have been doing is we have conducting simulations of microfluidics and doing two-phase flows and in very large scale simulations, both in terms of nanoscale, microscale, and then in continuum and multi-phase fluid mechanics problems. And finally, one of the most recent grandiose simulations that we have done is we have done direct numerical simulations of about 300 fish that are swimming here, and they are swimming together. Each one of them has a Reynolds number of 5,000, and you see all sorts of vortex rings and all these other things that are happening. There's no control here, so we just give them a motion and then we try to follow them, but we try to use adaptive mesh refinement and large-scale computers in order to do these simulations. Now, all these simulations, my experience after 40 years is that I think that doing all these large-scale simulations can be a useful exercise. There are things that one can extract knowledge from, but at the same time, they're horrendously expensive. The red blood cells, we had to use the Titan, the Oak Ridge supercomputer, the full machine for a day to perform just one simulation. The fish here, they have taken, I don't know how many months of the supercomputing time at CSES. So they're computationally expensive. And yes, the more we go into detail and the larger we make them, then we run into problems as to what we really can or should be computing. So that's not the situation about computing. That's the situation about computers beating people. So the fact that computers are powerful also has found another application besides what we do in the sciences. There is a whole bunch of different domains where computers are becoming interesting. But in this particular case, there is an interesting combination between computers and artificial intelligence, where the power of computers is not to solve physical systems, but to perform tasks that are relevant to artificial intelligence. So there is a lot of successes that people are using techniques, and particularly is a technique that I'll be talking about called reinforcement learning. There's people who have been working on the game of Go using reinforcement learning, and also people more recently, there is this announcement at EPFL together with DeepMind that they were looking into applying reinforcement learning to fusion plasmas. So there is a lot of interesting places that you see artificial intelligence going to games first and then slowly coming into the domain of sciences. And then the question is, there is all these wonderful things that people talk about artificial intelligence. Can we combine what we have been doing so far in computational science for complex systems with all the new things that are happening in artificial intelligence? Now, the thing that I would like to, from all these announcements about artificial intelligence, there is one particular thing that I like, which actually I think it resonates with the things that we try to do in computing. They are talking about what is the IA technology that will make chip, and that is the prediction. And then what does a chip prediction mean is to make decision making under uncertainty. This is a great book. It's written by economists, but I think many of the messages they're talking about is how can we make predictions, but also to make predictions in a chip way and under quantified uncertainties so that we can have effective decision making. I'd like to have a little parenthesis that this interface between fluid mechanics and AI has a previous history, and I don't know, many people talk about the winter of AI, and perhaps other people know who this person is. So this is James Lighthill, and perhaps many of you may know the Lighthill report.
Tonight, however, is with the overselling of the longer-term future of computers. The scientific community has a heavy responsibility to put forward its carefully considered view of the facts to avoid the public being seriously misled. Just as the US National Academy of Sciences did in 1966 when it reported that enormous sums of money.
So, and you can see here that what he was actually, one of the things that he was complaining about was about languages and that computers cannot do languages. And here you see automated transcription of what he says. And here you can see a mistake that the computer has done. He talks about enormous sums of money, and he talks about normal sums of money. But you see that technology has advanced. So at some point, fluid mechanicians and the way we have been thinking about the world may have not found AI compatible. And of course, there is also the other side that there is all these computer scientists that are looking at what we do, and they don't find our view of the world to be compatible with their vision. I mean, after all, we are misled by complicated differential equations involving continuous variables. So the question is there some room in the middle? So just a little historical remark. I started working in this room in the middle back when I was a postdoc at CTR. And then after 5 years, I was able to publish this paper where we were doing neural nets for the reconstruction of the near wall turbulent flow. And at that time, basically, we were showing, it was something that people in the machine learning community knew, that you can actually write linear PCA in terms of neural nets. And then the question was, can you replace the PCA, which in fluid mechanics was called POD, with neural nets? And what we found back then, that indeed it was possible to have much better reconstruction. And what we were trying at that time was actually to use wall-only information in order to reconstruct the flow above the wall. And I think we were, by accident, we did also deep neural networks because we were using a neural net with one layer and didn't work. So we said, why don't we put some more layers and then it worked anyway. So that's some of the things that I was doing back then. Now the difference with back then and today is if you look at the computers, you look at the computers, and this is how what is the computational speed up. So at that time, you would do a training of a neural net, and if you had access to supercomputer, it would have taken you about a year. And then if you do the same thing today, it takes you about 3 minutes. So that makes a completely difference as to what you think about all these things and how do you go about doing all these things. And also for myself, I remember at that time, I was trying desperately to find the journal to publish this application of machine learning algorithms to fluid mechanics. Only the CTR internal reports would publish it finally in 1999. And then when I compare with this, it has tons of citations, but I can tell you that this one was far more pioneering and more interesting, perhaps because we're doing also machine learning on experiments. In any case, so let's see, besides looking at history, which is the traditional thing for a Greek person to do, I'd like to tell you some more research things that we have been doing. So I'd like to tell you about how to use machine learning to do prediction. So from all this prediction, I will be looking into one particular architecture since I'm interested in time series. So I will be looking into this recurrent neural networks where the idea is that you have some data, and the data, they have some hierarchy in time. And then we are very much interested to see whether recurrent neural networks can be used to predict the flow instead of using the equations. So the equation that I will show you results for is the Kuramoto-Shivashinsky equation. So it's a fourth order partial differential equation here. And then what we can do is we can discretize it with a finite difference or other schemes. And what I want you to observe is that you change this nu, which is a parameter in the Kuramoto-Shivashinsky, then you see that the patterns, they become, if you want, start to exhibit finer and finer scales as we change this parameter nu. So now the idea is that we wanted to get some data. So we want to get some data from the Kuramoto-Shivashinsky. Let's say we were interested in collecting some data. This is the XT diagram of the Kuramoto-Shivashinsky, and this is the quantity of interest that here is a contour plot. This is U over X as a change in time. So the idea is, can I collect some data here, train my neural net, and then throw away the equation and try to predict? So we spent quite a lot of time trying to do that by using one particular architecture, which was the long short-term memory networks. And long story short, what we ended up realizing is that if we wanted to train, we had to reduce the dimensionality of the full data. And then what we decided to do at that time, we decided to do a singular value decomposition, or PCA, or whatever you want to call it, and then to reduce the dimensionality of the data. So instead of training on the full dimensionality of the problem, we decided to train on the reduced dimensionality of the problem because we thought, we found that this was a more interesting exercise. I want to tell you that actually this is actually related to a pairing between the dimensionality of the data and the particular machine that we were using to train. And this is, in a sense, a problem that the LSTMs have. If you go to other networks, high dimensional data may be more helpful in order to train. But nevertheless, this idea that I'd like to show you also later, I have high dimensional data, I project them into a lower dimensional space, and then I train on this low dimensional space, and then I'm trying to predict what's going on. So this is the long short-term memory networks. The long short-term memory networks, they're trying to look, they take into account how far in the past you should go in order to do predictions for the future. And then, so here's what we do. We are having the state evolution, and then we are looking at the mode evolution. And then what we do is we do the training in this domain. And then we're gonna, through this SVD, we can go back and do a projection back into the full space. So if you wanna see what it looks like, so after we have trained for a certain time, right after this time, of course, everything is working very well. The predictions is the blue points, the green is the true. And then as I look at what happens a little bit later, I'm still doing okay. After I double the time, you start to see some problems. And after, if I want to extrapolate to much later times, I find that this methodology doesn't work. So at some point, this whole thing breaks down. It's good up to a certain time, but after a while, it simply breaks down. You can see actually what is the forecasting error that we have. You can see that even at earlier times, you have a forecasting error. So using, at least my experience is that using these recurrent neural nets and LSTM, you train them, and I can tell you we spend quite a lot of time on that. You train them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can throw away the equations and keep forecasting only with the LSTMs. I want to show you also the effect of the chaoticity of the system in the quality of the forecasting. So I mentioned you have this nu, which is, if it is 0.1, you have relatively easy trajectories. The blue is what you predict by the RNN. The green is the truth. And then if you start to make the system a lot more chaotic, then you see that you are diverging quite fast. Nevertheless, there was a paper that appeared in Quantum magazine that says machine learning has an amazing ability to predict chaos. And actually, they were quoting us as one of the people that we have shown that indeed it's possible to predict chaotic systems, even though we had shown that it's not possible to predict chaotic systems. There's all sorts of different chaotic systems. There's Lorentz 63, Lorentz 96, Lorentz 69. So you have to be careful about what people tell you they predict. Okay, so that's the message. And the message that I want to say is based on my experience is the machine learning is not able to predict chaotic systems. And I'm happy to argue forever about that. And there's a few papers that we have done. A lot of them have been done actually with your colleague and my friend, Themis Sapsis here. This one in particular, we compare, we answer the question about the matching between the particular learning machine and the dimensionality of the data. And it's quite an extensive study about what machines to use when. So now, so I think that machine learning is not predictive for complex physical systems. That's what is machine learning, of course. We can specify at least some of the things that we have tried are not predictive as if you just apply them. But the idea is, can you combine some of the tricks that we have learned over decades of scientific computing together with machine learning? And everybody has a buzzword. My buzzword is alloys. The idea is same way that you have two metals, and then when you put them together, you have a new thing that maybe is better than each one of the constituents. That is my hope, where AI and computational science may be coming together. So this is an alloy for those that they don't know alloys, but I will use these images to describe the different algorithms that I have. So you can have a pure metal, which is one particular metal, and then you can replace some of these parts with AI, or you can have the scientific computing. I'm using the red as a scientific compute, and then you can have interstitial alloys where you're interfacing, you're sprinkling some in AI, and of course you can have both of the two things. And I would like to show you what is some of the ideas that I have, but I'd like to use this image as a way of how I see the interfacing of AI and scientific computing. The first alloy, it's actually not the first that we developed, but it's the latest. And this latest alloy, we call it learning the effective dynamics of complex systems. And the idea here is, I have my computational simulations. They are expensive. Can I introduce some machine learning where I replace some part of the simulations with AI, but then I keep also the simulations? I told you before that if I do a simulation and then I drop the simulation and I do only recurrent neural nets, doesn't work. What about if I do a little bit of simulations, a little bit of neural nets, a little bit of simulations? So now this idea, the credit for this idea, actually, this idea has been around for about 20 plus years. This idea the credit goes to Yannis Kevrekidis, who was not calling it learning effective dynamics. He was calling it equation-free framework. And I'd like to show you what Yannis did and how we try to improve on his methodology. The idea of Yanis is that you have some short time scales, that we call them the micro scale, and these are the expensive simulations that you have. And then what you do is you find a way to go down to a reduced order space, and this is the macro scale. You can go down through an SVD or a filtering or whichever other way you would like. Now the idea of Yanis, which was pretty cool, was, okay, now that I am in this reduced order space, I can use just the snapshots and then do an integration by using data from these snapshots. If you have an Euler, if you have a system at time t and a time t plus delta t, then you can derive a derivative using the Euler's method and then use this derivative to advance the system. That was the idea that I was promoted back then by Yanis. And then the big thing was the lifting. How do you go back to the micro scale? You went there for some time, and the question is, how do you go back to the micro scale? So we tried to, Yanis introduced me to this idea about 25 years ago when he visited me when I first went to ETH. So it stayed in my mind. And after all these excursions in machine learning, I think something clicked. And that's, I think, what is a suggestion that we have of how to fix perhaps this methodology. So one way to go down to the scale, to the macro scale from the micro scale, is by using autoencoders. So the autoencoders they're self-sufficient. You get the snapshots from the micro state of the system, and then by reconstructing this through an encoder and a decoder, you have an expression for your latent space, which is the latent space Z. You can decide that you have a different encoder and a different decoder in case you are interested in a stochastic reconstruction of your system. So as you may imagine, this is the way that I will be going down from the micro scale to the macro scale, because I'm going to be using the decoders that I have just learned to fix the lifting problem that was an open question, in my opinion, in Yanis' methodology. And the second thing, you saw that when I have reduced data, recurrent neural nets work relatively well. So I'm going to be using what I learned about recurrent neural nets and LSTMs to advance the latent space of my system. So I like to give, again, credit to Yanis for all this, but this is the methodology that we call learning effective dynamics. This is work also with Caroline Uller, who is here at MIT. Again, the idea is that I train an encoder. I have the RNNs that are operating on the latent space that has been produced by the encoder. And then we return back from the decoder to perform simulations after a certain time. And then we iterate. There's tons of questions here about are your encoders, decoders fixed? Can you adapt them? What is the time scale that you use for one? When do you decide to go back out? When do you decide to go back in? So on and so forth. We are looking into them, but allow me for the moment to give you this vanilla version with these ideas, and I'd like to show you some of the results of how this methodology is behaving. So starting with the Koumoutsakos-Shivasinski, so here's the reference solution. And now the interesting thing is that here there is a paper that has suggested that the effective dynamics lie in a 9-dimensional manifold. When we did before the PCA of the Koumoutsakos-Shivasinski, I didn't stress it, but we were using about 20 modes from the energy in order to recover 20 modes in order to recover about 95% of the energy. What we should have been doing, we have been looking for an 8-dimensional manifold, because actually this is a more appropriate way to describe the Koumoutsakos-Shivasinski. And now what was interesting is that when we actually, if you look at the mean square error that we do with the different compressions, we actually found that the autoencoders were able to, in my opinion, to figure out this dimensionality, the latent dimension of 8 in a quite a natural way. And then by using autoencoders, different types of autoencoders, and having an 8-dimensional latent space, we were able to get a very good reconstruction of the field, which was much better than what PCA would give you. So you have different ways to go down to the latent space. We found the autoencoders to be an interesting one, and in this particular case, to recover analytical results. So now what you see in the middle, that's the evolution of the latent space by doing the LED. I will tell you how often we go in and out of the fine scales. And this is the reconstruction that the LED does. If you go one-to-one, you see that there are differences. But if you look at the phase space between the velocity, the first derivative of the velocity and the second derivative of the velocity, you see that the LED has behaved quite well. And at the same time, if you look in, now we're looking at the ratio. This is the ratio, how much time I spend in the macro, how much time I spend in the micro. And then depending on what is this ratio, you can see the corresponding errors that I have here. So it seems actually that the error remains about constant. So we could have as well stay on the latent space. And that's where I'm showing that we never go back into the fine space, and the error would have been as good as what has been earlier. So we're looking to find out as to what can we do to improve this error and so on. But these are some of the results that you can get. So you can get quite some speed up. But again, I don't see the error dying completely. So that's something that we're trying to investigate. We did it also for flows past cylinders. So now what was interested is that we took all the data on the velocities and pressure in a two-dimensional simulation, 5, 12, 10, 24. Latent dimension was 4, and it has a pretty big time step. And now again, we actually here we found that we had a much better behavior in the sense that as we increase this ratio of macro to micro, we found that there is some kind of consistency of how our error is going. And the other thing that was quite interesting is that we also saw that when we look at the drag coefficient seems to be within 4%, even when we are almost fully in the latent space. So this is a success, and here is a failure that we report also in the paper. When we go to Reynolds number of 1,000, then we start to have larger errors, even in the drag coefficient. The drag coefficient is 20%. But now the thing that we see is that the bigger errors that we make the biggest errors around the surface of the cylinder. And this actually makes sense because that's actually where the action is taking place. And the mistake, if you like, that we have done is that the data that we used in order to train the autoencoders were data that they were uniformly distributed in our computational domain. We should have spent more data where the physics is, but then that means that you know something about the physics. And I'm happy to say that knowing something about the physics can help you. And we are working on that. And we have also preliminary results that indeed, if you collect more data from the near the cylinder, the errors here are going down. I'm not going to discuss these things. We also did it. This methodology of the learned effective dynamics is quite general. You can apply it also to molecular dynamics. So here is a phase space of a simple molecule, the alanine dipeptide. And then you can describe the dynamics of the alanine dipeptide by two angles, the phi and the psi here. And then you see here that there are certain places where this alanine dipeptide likes to exist. And indeed, when we did this with using this LED framework and having basically 1 degree of freedom in the latent space, that would correspond to some kind of a effective free energy. And then when we looked at the behavior of what does it look like, this latent space, we actually found that it has distinct minima, and each one of these minima corresponds to one of these locations where the full system likes to find its place. At the same time, if you compare the reference and the LED is not able to capture some of the areas that the full system is visiting. And again, the question is, what is the thing that makes us fail, and how can we improve on that? So tons of interesting things here. So the second thing the second idea that I'd like to pursue, and maybe I'll go on demand here, is this idea of using reinforcement learning. And the idea here, so can I combine computational scientific computing and reinforcement learning? So what is reinforcement learning? The idea is that you have an agent, and then this agent can take different actions. It can also receive a stimulus from the environment, and also you give to this agent a reward. And then the idea is if you have a particular stimulus action pattern that is favorable through reward, then the actor is conditioned on this particular behavior. This sounds all like jargon. One of the persons that first did this in actual experiments was actually at Harvard, as I found out. It was Skinner. I don't know if you guys know Skinner. So he did this with pigeons.
The two pigeons are at either end of a small ping pong table. One pigeon pecks the ball as it comes toward him and knocks it toward the other pigeon. The other pigeon pecks the ball back across the table. If it goes past one pigeon, the other pigeon can eat, and if it goes the other way, the other pigeon eats. So there's it's a real game. The pigeon is reinforced for a cross-court shot.
So he was giving them food every time the ball would go across, and then that apparently has taught them how to play. I tried this with my kids. It doesn't really work, but anyway. Now the thing about him was not very peaceful. I don't know if you know about these pigeon pilots. You know why he was doing that? So the idea was, this is the time of the Cold War, and the idea is, can I get some missiles to some other place, and how can I guide them? The idea is that you train these pigeons to peck on a button every time they see a particular image. So imagine that you have a pigeon inside the rocket, and then as the rocket is flying and the pigeon sees outside, let's say, a particular area where the bomb should fall, then the pigeon pecks, and then the thing opens, and you bomb the place. This was funded by ARPA, I think, at that time. Thank God they didn't deploy this, but that's where reinforcement learning actually, a lot of the work of Skinner, actually, there's a great article by the MIT Technology Review about pigeon pilots that it's worth checking out. It's pretty horrific, actually, nevertheless. So now this reinforcement learning actually is pretty interesting in many games. People have been using it. I'd like to say that I was first exposed to reinforcement learning and the game of Go by a postdoc that I had by the name of Tore Greipel back in 2000. And Tore at that time wanted to do the game of Go in a 5x5 board. And then I was telling him, Tore, please do fluid mechanics. And Tore says, no, I want to do the game of Go. So Tore is one of the key authors of the paper that did the game of Go. And he's one of the big people in DeepMind. And I think now he moved to this company that they do this aging and health. He's the chief scientific officer. Key message is, let your postdocs do what they want, and then it's better to follow. Anyway, so what is reinforcement learning? And another way to look at it, what you have is you have basically a network or function or anything you want. And the idea, what I have here is you have a function that you basically dumps out the mean and a variance of a Gaussian probability distribution. So you're giving as input whatever you decide the input should be. And then a recurrent neural net has some initial weights, and then it gives a mean and a variance out of this network. And then based on, you take an action, this affects the environment. The environment comes back with a reward. And the idea is that you have to change stochastically the weights of your network so that you maximize the long-term reward. So it's like dynamic programming, but stochastic. That's in a nutshell what it is. So now if you look at, if you apply this to problems in flow control, some of the things that I was always very interested in trying to find methods that would avoid any kind of differentiation through the Navier-Stokes equations. And the other thing that was always very difficult for me was to see how can I control an equation and at the same time control a quantity of interest that will be a derivative of this particular equation. So it was always, gradient-based methods were always intimidating to me. So I always favored stochastic techniques. So I also favored this reinforcement learning. Now, the idea of reinforcement learning is that basically, given certain states and actions, how can I find a control mechanism to achieve a particular reward? Now, the problem in flow control is that you have a lot of things that are not stationary. samples are expensive to evaluate, are not like computer games, and the states that you have cannot be every pixel that you have in the computer game. So what do there is another thing also that we do. If you play the game many times, you have to play the story of exploration versus exploitation. So how many of the things that you have learned you have to use in order to accelerate the current exploration that you're to accelerate the current exploration by exploiting previous experiences that you have. So here's an idea by Guido Novati called Remember and Forget Experience Replay. I think it's a very interesting idea, and I'm stressing it because one of the things I think in reinforcement learning that I will show you is if you take an off-the-shelf type of package and try to apply it in fluid mechanics problems, my experience is that this does not always work. And this is different from taking TensorFlow and applying them to do neural nets and all these other things where TensorFlow is pretty powerful. Here, I think you have to adapt a little bit into fluid mechanics, the reinforcement learning algorithm that you're choosing. So what is experiences? The idea is that you are playing the game many times and you're collecting tuples of states, rewards, policies, and actions that you have taken. And now the question is, after you have played all these games, which one of these past experiences is relevant to the problem that you have right now in front of you? So now, if you every time that you play the game, you have to go and to sample, find the policy that you're using. This can be very expensive. So people thought about that long before us, and they thought about this idea of experience replay. So the idea is, let me use some of the past experiences to sample the state actions that I'm having right now. Now, if you look at it, basically from the point of view of a person that has been trained in physics, what you do here is you're trying to maximize an expectation under a certain probability distribution. So the idea of experience replay is you don't use the probability distribution that you're creating right now, but you're using a probability distribution, another probability distribution that you have already obtained. So this is called importance sampling in physics, basically. And now the people who do reinforcement learning, and I have given this talk in front of audiences of reinforcement learning people, I think this has not been very much noticed, that what they do with experience replay is basically importance sampling. So some of the issues that you have with experience replay in reinforcement learning is you may choose one of the experiences, but the experience that you're choosing may be very different from where you are at the moment. So this ratio that you're doing when you're doing importance sampling may go to 0 and may blow up. And the other thing that you have is that the two probability distributions, they should have some relevance. And if they don't have a relevance, then you should not be doing importance sampling. To the best of my knowledge, this has not been addressed by many of the experience replay papers, and that's the thing that Guido brought up, and we tried to fix. And the idea was the idea is that whenever this ratio, this weight becomes outside a certain trust region, then you're rejecting these particular samples. And the other thing that we try to do is to have some kind of a penalization based on the KL divergence between the current policy that you have and the policy that you're bringing from the past. And of course, when you penalize that, obviously, you are guiding your system to be stable in the sense that you are strapping it onto your past behaviors. Long story short, this is the results on all these Multiagent problems. These are some state-of-the-art algorithms. Here you're looking at the cumulative reward on all these Multiagent problems by different methods like DDPG and DDPG with prioritized experience replay. And the blue one is the method of Guido that we call refer. And the interesting thing is when we took and we applied reinforcement learning to the problem of I have a device here and I train it to stay behind a certain region that I will show you later maybe. Every reinforcement learning algorithm that we found off the shelf, we couldn't work, but refer was able to find a solution. So I advertise Refer, and it's also open source and free, and you can download it. And there's a library that Guido and the others have made in the lab called Smarties that can hopefully be plug and play. Yeah, here's a comparison with the people of Michael Jordan, Peter Abil. On the right is the humanoid we came up with, and on the left is their humanoid. I mean, this is all artificial mechanics, but we do get some very good results. Let me show you some, I'll go quite fast on some control problems that we have been doing. We have been looking into fish swimming. And the idea of fish swimming is you try to see how you can get fish to swim together and to find and to understand whether it is useful to get fish to swim together. So there's different models. And now for me, when we started doing all that stuff, the first question is, in order to find out if collective swimming is efficient, first of all, I have to make the fish swim together. So how do you put fish to swim together? That's an interesting control problem. So if you give them some kind of movement to do, well, they do their movement, but you have to be really lucky that they stay together. I think Wim here probably remembers many of these things, that they start to fly left and right. You can change the parameters. It was a very difficult problem to get them. You put them down and you tell them, okay, go together. They don't go together, okay? They have flow structure interaction. So what we did is we used reinforcement learning. And so we have states and we have actions and we have rewards. I will not go into the details about what are the states and the actions, but then you see that differently from the Atari games, we just give them very few states because we have expensive functions, so we cannot afford to go through all the to do very many calculations because they are expensive. So when we want to sample the state action space, we try to keep the state action space small. So here we have a swimmer, and then we ask the swimmer, please stay in line with the swimmer in front. So the swimmer in the back is the one that is controlled, and it learns to swim behind the other swimmer. And this was fine, but then we realized also that the power of deformation of the swimmer behind was actually much less than the power of deformation of this swimmer, which meant that the swimmer behind was extracting energy from the wake of the front swimmer. So in fact, it increases efficiency by about 12%. So now have a look about where it swims. It swims right there in this line. Then we changed the cost function and we said, okay, now swim in order to maximize your efficiency. And now it found another way of doing that, where it cuts through the vortices. So it synchronizes the velocity of the flow field with the velocity of the head. That's the key message. And then we actually got about 28% gain in the average efficiency. There's a lot of fun we have more recently by putting more than two swimmers to swim together. So if you ask more than two to swim together, it starts to get more and more difficult for the swimmers that are in the back because they start to get more and more of a dirty flow, as you may imagine. And the other thing that was quite interesting is when we asked them to maximize the efficiency, we found a lot of interesting things, that you start to get clusters of swimmers separating from the others and doing their own thing. So there is a lot of fun behaviors that you can get. So it's a very rich way of exploring physical systems, this reinforcement learning, that you are basically specifying a cost function, and you give a lot of degrees of freedom of how this cost function can be satisfied. So we have done things in 3D. I'm not going to go into too many details of how we did it. I'll just show you some simulations just because they're nice. And here, basically, there's no reinforcement learning. There's a PID controller that we figure out that we could not do reinforcement learning on the 3D swimmers because it was overly expensive. But using knowledge from 2D, we found out that there should be a synchronicity between the velocity of the flow field and the velocity of the fish. And that's how we use the PID controller to put the fish there to extract energy from these vortices. And of course, you can have lots of interesting things where you can have fish extracting energy from whatever vortex may be available. And this fish up there, even though it looks like it's in a messy flow, it's actually extracting a lot of energy because it's able to continuously use energy that is coming from the vortices coming from the fish in front. We also do more recently these things in microfluidics. We have some artificial bacteria flagella, and then we tell them to target specific cells inside different domains. But I will not tell you about the failures of reinforcement learning. There are many. I'll tell you another application of reinforcement learning. This was work with Jane Bai, who came with us for a few months and now is an assistant professor at Caltech. And now the idea is the following, and that's an idea I'm particularly excited and I'm trying to pursue more research. So when we have a full equation, sometimes we cannot solve the full equation, but we can solve another equation that involves some filter terms. And then you have a right-hand side where you have all the things that you cannot resolve, okay? So now if you look at it, to me, it starts to look like a control problem where you are looking as to how can I supply some kind of a controller to achieve a certain objective. So same way, the people who do LES and RANS and coarse-grained molecular dynamics and so on, they're coming up with clever ways of achieving something like that. The idea is, can I do this through reinforcement learning? And so can I come up with closure models that are being derived from reinforcement learning strategies? Now, the idea is that you have a system, you have a PDE that you're solving it on a grid, it's a coarse grid. And then at the same time, you have agents. So you have multiple agents in different parts of the grid. You don't want to have one agent operating in all the grid points because the states that you have then are a lot. So if you, let's say you're doing a 32 cube grid, and then you're using as a state every point on the grid, that's a lot of states. Instead, what we do is we put an agent in each one of the grid points and is using only local information. And then the actions of this agent are to interpolate on the nearby grid points or to synergize with the other agents in order to decide what should be the proper closure. So this is multi-agent reinforcement learning. Again, multi-agent helps you to reduce the dimensionality of the problem. It has a lot of advantages because you can put the agents, more agents in some areas, less agents in other areas to probe the domain. And I'll tell you a little bit some results about that. So I think you all know what a homogeneous isotropic turbulence looks like. I will not complain about supervised learning. I'll show you results from reinforcement learning. So here's the idea. The idea is that I'm doing an LES of a large eddy simulation of a homogeneous turbulent flow. And now here are the states that we're using. Now here, Hugh and Guido and Les myself, we spent a lot of time to find out what are the right states. So if you use as states the local velocity field, we never got anything to converge. So then we spent quite some time to figure out what is it that we want to have as state. So we thought, okay, this is homogeneous isotropic turbulent flow. Then we thought that you should have as states to be the invariances of the local invariances of the gradient tensor and of the Laplacian tensor. So that gives you 5 + 6, 11 states that you are considering. Then we looked as giving us more global states. These are local states. And then we thought on top of that to tell the system to use some global quantities as states. So we use the effective dissipation and the total dissipation plus 15 components of the Fourier modes of the energy spectrum that we wanted to eventually use as a reward. So we had 28 states. And then what we were controlling, basically, we were using an artificial viscosity model like the classical Smagorinsky, dynamic Smagorinsky model, except that this coefficient here, we were deriving it through reinforcement learning. Okay, so we were not using a particular formalism that people do in LES. We were just learning it through reinforcement learning. And then the reward, what was the reward? We played with different rewards. The reward that we found to be the best was the distance between the energy spectrum that you have and the energy spectrum that you have from DNS. So we don't ask someone to give us the flow field everywhere. We ask a spectrum. So you could give me the spectrum from an experiment or whatever else you want. And in that sense, I think this MARL is more data efficient than perhaps the supervised learning algorithms. So here is the results. The results here is you see the energy spectrum that we get. The black line is the truth, is what's coming out from the DNS. And then I want you to pay attention to the blue line, and then I'll tell you what is the red and what is the yellow. But the blue is basically you are training these agents on these Reynolds numbers that you see here. And now this is the place where we are asking the agents to perform. So they are performing out of sample. And here, actually, when they go up to Reynolds lambda of 205, they're outside from the regime where they have been first trained. So there we find that they extrapolate. So you can see the green is the dynamic Smagorinsky model. The purple is the standard Smagorinsky model, which are pretty good for these flows. But you see that the blue, actually, which is coming out from the multi-agent reinforcement learning, is performing really, really well. The yellow is if you train the reinforcement learning only with one data set, Reynolds number of 111. And that's where the yellow and the blue are together. How well does this behave? So it doesn't behave so bad. It's okay. And the other thing was, how do you choose the policy? Here we choose as a policy where the reward was the satisfaction of the Germano identity, which is a particular identity that people are supposed to satisfy in turbulent flows. And then we found that when you satisfy the Germano identity, this did not allow you to capture the energy spectrum. So you have to be careful about that. There is another work, which is, again, that was done with Jane. And the idea was to do wall models for LES. And here, I don't think I have the correct slide. Again, the states were the big deal here, to find the right states. And there, basically, Jane's idea was to use an estimate of the law of the wall. So there's the law of the wall that tells you how U plus is relating to Y plus. And then there are two coefficients, a kappa and a beta. And what we try to do is not to plug in the kappa and the beta that someone gives us, but to create an estimate of the kappa and the beta. It's a pity I don't have the right slides to show you what were the states that allowed us to do that. But in any case, the story was that here we were training up to Reynolds number of 8,000, RE tau 8,000, and then the method was able to produce reasonable results going up to RE tau of 10 to the 6. And these are all the different reconstructions, if you like, of the log law. And the other thing that was quite exciting is to take training that was done for a channel flow and apply it in a turbulent boundary layer. And there is no training here, just extrapolation to another flow. So it's generalization. And here the reinforcement learning model seemed to be capturing the friction coefficient well. There is a lot of interesting models that I think Adrian will know much better than I do, like the equilibrium wall model. And these are results from the equilibrium wall model about the velocity field in a certain height above the wall and the shear stresses on the wall. This is what the equilibrium wall model, which is the popular model, gives you, which is what the reinforcement learning model gives you. And what you find is that people argue that there is a correlation coefficient that is spuriously very strong on the equilibrium wall model, and the reinforcement learning model seems to be more does not exhibit this correlation. So I think I'm running out of time. I'd like to say a summary of what I have learned. And I think it's very interesting not to throw away all the things that we have done in scientific computing, but I think it's interesting to approach them with knowledge from machine learning and vice versa. So I think data and equation-driven approaches, there is a lot of interesting things that can happen on this domain. And I think for the things that I do, having some theory would be very useful. More advanced machine learning and more interesting applications will be interesting to do. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
So let's first take questions here in person. So if anyone has a question, we can go ahead with that. Otherwise, we can take a look at the chat. Any questions here? Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Great talk. Really enjoyed it. Just a clarification on this approach where you talk about the upscaling, the Yanis Herbert-Kridis approach.
Yeah.
When you say you go back to the finer scale, what exactly do you do? What does that was not clear to me. So you have the latent state, then all in a sudden you decide to go to the fine and go back to the latent.
Yeah.
What happens?
So I go back and I reinitialize my fine scale simulations.
Independent simulation. All you have is the latent information.
That's right. And I have the latent and the decoder. So I'm using, so here when I do the training, when I do the training, here, this is the input data from the micro scale. And the decoder, this is the output data from the micro scale. So this is the same data. Now, there is this encoder that compresses the data, and now you learn a decoder at the same time. So you learn the two. So if you give me a Z, I know how to get out to this through this decoder. That's all.
Okay. And then you use the encoder again to go down. So it's not clear that going to the finer scale brings a lot more new information than just sustaining the latent scale.
For the results for some of the results that I have, yes. For other results, no, which means it's good to do that. And we try to figure it out, how, why, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so it's a lot of interesting things there. Yeah.
Great, really. Put on, okay. Oh, okay, Zan, yeah. Great talk, Peter. Thank you. Two questions. One is experimental data. Can you comment on this and to what extent you've used it and what the challenges are? And the second one was a different question about in generally. I mean, I think you used mainly equation-based data, right? And then used it to, but you could also use experimental data potentially.
So should I answer this first? Yes. So when I first started doing machine learning at Stanford, we were interested in doing control, and then I abandoned the idea of using simulations to use some of the techniques that I was doing. So I was working with Bill Reynolds to do AI on experiments. So what I'd like to say is that this reinforcement learning, I think it's very well suited to experiments because it requires little data. And then it gives you a lot of degrees of freedom to what you can do experimentally. So for the same way as what the guy did with the pigeons, I think taking reinforcement learning and applying it to experiments would be really wonderful. We have a couple of projects that we do that. One is with John Dabiri, where we first did, let me see if I have what we tried to do. So here's a project we do with John on navigation. Anyway, so basically you have something that you wanted to navigate, and then John is preparing some robots that we're going to send out in the ocean, and what should they sense and so on in order to go out and do things in the ocean. There's another one that is, I think that's the thing with John. Yeah. This is there's both
designed to create different flows.
There's two things that are going on here. So let me see. So one is on the right is with the Dabiri group, and the other one is something that we tried to do with a friend in Geneva. You know the cast that Caltech has, this wind tunnel that they have this. So this was developed by a former Caltech graduate called Flavio Noca. He developed a company called WindShape. So CAST has bought this device from WindShape. And the idea of WindShape is you're creating velocity profiles in order to test drones. Okay, so now you have all these turbines that are rotating. How can you train them in order to give you a particular velocity profile? That we try with Flavio to do through reinforcement learning. So we're looking at atmospheric data. And then the idea is now you have a device that can produce wind. Can I change the rotation of all these windmills that I have to produce experimental data? Because then I can test my drones inside this data. So this is that. Now for the LED, I think I can do it if you can, you or whoever is experimentalist can initialize the conditions to whatever, whenever I come out from the latent space. If I am to stay on the latent space, that's okay. And that's actually would be already an interesting thing, that you take some experimental data, you do LED, and you see where you arrive. But I think if you want to do the whole thing, it would be nice if you can go back to, so if you, I don't have a, I think when we were trying to write the paper, someone asked this question. I don't know if it was the same, but it's obviously a good question to ask. And the reviewer asked it and we couldn't answer. Better than what I told you. Yeah.
No, that's it. So maybe.
But you had the second question.
Oh, yeah.
Probably very long answer actually, but one thing that we actually tried and to some success is to think about training another neural net to correct an error. You talked about the increasing error in the beginning, and the question was, have you tried this to train another neural net to actually learn how to fix the error that the first neural net makes, basically?
Yeah, no, I have not. I have not tried that. No, I have not.
In protein folding problems, and that's an interesting concept.
Okay.
Where you can essentially encapsulate, and probably you can do this at multiple levels in a hierarchical scheme. But
we're happy to hear more, to learn more from you about that. We haven't tried. Yeah.
Okay, let's take one question online. So I think that the question, I read the question, I think it's about, so people like the classic models because they give a good trade-off between accuracy and the performance, and also the classic models, like the typical physics-based, physics-based models. And I think that the question is, how is your group in a way integrating that, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, has your group investigated if there's a trade-off between accuracy of prediction and computational cost?
The trade-off between that in your models. Yeah.
I mean, we did that in particular on the LED. On the LED, if you look at, I went, as always, I present too many things. So on the LED, so let's take that. So if you look here, this is the how much faster you are. This is the speed up that you get. Okay, and this is the speed up that you get because this depends on the ratio of the amount of time that you spend on the macro level versus on the micro level. So the more you spend on the latent space instead of doing the full DNS of the cylinder, the less CPU time you have, the more you speed up. But at the same time, if you look at the error, then you start to have more error. And then here we found to be a linear relationship between speed up and error, but this can be problem dependent. So that's something where I think would be really nice to have theory. I don't have theory. We need some theory. This is all empirical results.
Okay, I think that we are going to close with this. So thanks a lot for coming, and thanks a lot, Petros, for this.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, and thank you all for coming.